tonight's discussion is an extension of one that we had a few weeks ago here with some comrades from Occupy Gezi in Turkey. It was a discussion about Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Gezi and protest and public space, but also the need to move beyond just thinking about protest and also temporarily holding space and more into a discussion of sustainably cultivating an urban commons. This is a direction that a lot of folks in the kind of post-Occupy landscape are thinking, and it's also something obviously that that has long histories of grassroots struggle in the city and around the world. And so this concept of building the commons, right? It implies the commons isn't just a shared resource pool that's sitting there waiting to be tapped. It's something that has to actively be built and struggled for in the way that someone like Silvia Federici describes it. And it's also something that at a very precarious and small scale is something that emerged at Zuccotti Park, but also something that, that emerges, as I say, through grassroots struggles all over the world. A key question in discussing urban commoning, and so this idea of moving from commons as a noun to commoning as a verb, is the question of decommodifying land, removing it from the speculative market for collective use. And the way in which that intersects in turn with questions of racial justice. So those are a couple of the questions just to throw out there. Tonight's discussion is conceived not as an isolated event, but it's just one iteration of a set of conversations that are really intensifying around the city right now about land, about alternative economies, about the right to the city. And so the event tonight is really just a chance to create some new connections, bring together some voices that might not have encountered one another before, to create a dialogue with different kinds of work and different disciplines and different areas of activism, and if possible, connect the dots between different kinds of work that's going on, and maybe even thinking about how to leverage some of the resources that we can sometimes have access to in academia, in the arts, and in architecture relative to bigger struggles. Also, it's something maybe we can talk about is future possibilities for creating a citywide infrastructure of commoning in various arenas, including habitation, food, and work, and based in kind of practices of militant research. And I think Nick Mertzoff may have brought the Militant Research Handbook. Cool, so that'll be passed around. And this is something that we're doing, just to give you a sense of this more expanded conversation, something that every Monday night at 16 Beaver Space by Wall Street, we're doing a series of commoning courses that explore the concept of commoning, and it's all about learning from practices that are already going on in the city and trying to connect some of those dots into a bigger infrastructure. Another opportunity to extend the conversation from tonight is coming up at the Brooklyn Base on November 2nd, where there'll be a discussion of squatting and land trusts, among many other forms of organizing around housing and space. And then finally, and this is something Manissa I think we'll talk about, but there's a kind of percolation around the idea of building a New York City anti-eviction network that would build upon and support and help to amplify the long history of housing struggles that already are going on in New York. So here are the big takeaways for tonight. There's this big conversation happening. This is one iteration of it. It's just one node in a bigger constellation. And for those of you interested in keeping up this dialogue into future events and meetings, we're going to be passing around a sheet if you want updates from this emerging anti-eviction network. So look out for that. All right, so tonight's discussion is going to be anchored by 5 very short presentations. And the prompt is really simple. It's really just to say, provide a sense from each of the presenters, their background, what they're working on now, what kind of future they'd like to see in terms of their work. And then maybe this is part of the bigger discussion at the end, how, if at all, the horizon of the commons resonates with their work, or not, right? That's the question. So we're going to ask each presenter to keep it under 10 minutes. That'll take us up to around a little bit after 8. And at that point, we can open it up to discussion and have kind of a jam session. And we've got a lot of very, very knowledgeable people in the audience that I can see just from looking here, from a lot of different backgrounds and disciplines and also activist groups. So we want to make sure to keep a lot of time at the end for discussion and networking and building some of those critical connections that we'll need to build a citywide network in this regard. Okay, so our first remarks are going to come to us from Manissa.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Yates and Christina for inviting me into this space, for having this discussion. Just who I am, to start with, I'm a graduate student in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm in my fieldwork stage of my project. I'm doing a project about politics post-Occupy, and I'm looking at gentrification and anti-gentrification as sort of part of that. I'm also doing an oral history project on youth activists who are involved in Occupy. So that's sort of what I'm doing academically, which connects to what I'm talking about tonight. But also who I am, I guess part of my history in thinking about gentrification and housing and commons and all these things connected tie into my personal history. I was born and raised in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. My family lived there for about 30 years until the house that my father was living in was bought and sold to someone else, and he was evicted, and we were ultimately displaced from the neighborhood. So I guess I tell that story just to say that there's like a real personal interest of mine in thinking about commons and anti-eviction work and the way these two things go together. And I think that story also, like, if you live in New York, you sort of know the story of displacement that has been, in some ways, the status quo in New York, especially for the past 12 years. So whether because you've seen people around you be displaced, or you've seen your friends be displaced, or you've seen a neighborhood change around you as you lived there and you could no longer afford it, a lot of us know these stories. It's sort of, and one of the things I like to think about, or one of the things I keep thinking about, is really the way that this whole process feels, right? That there's a really like affective dimension to this process that we don't talk about as much. And I'm really excited to be on a panel that's interdisciplinary because I think we can talk about the way like architecture feels as well. So it's something I want us to think about is like, what are these urban places that we like call home? How do they feel to us, and how do we regain power over the way that they feel and the processes that happen that sort of cause those feelings? So I think about affect a lot too in my research. So that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. But just to, Yates and Christina asked me to do some like background, like landscape of New York. And so just broadly, the landscape in New York, which I think a lot of us here know already, is that we live in a highly unequal city, right? So New York City is the most segregated city not most segregated, the most unequal city in the country. So not just a kind of unequal place, but actually the most unequal place, right? The most unequal city in the country. And then also, what I was about to say was a highly segregated place as well. So we live in a city that's consistently, or depending on how you count, is in either of the top three, or has the third or second place as the most segregated city in the country. So we're really unequal and we're really segregated. Fun times. And I guess I say those things because the processes that caused those two things to happen are not natural processes. They're not organic processes. So one of the things I also try to work on in my research and also in my teaching is trying to denaturalize the processes around gentrification, so that we stop looking at this as like, oh, cities change and these processes happen and they become unaffordable and that's just the way things go, right? That this sort of naturalization of the status quo of heavily commodified property relations, actually there's been a long process that has caused those relations to happen. And in New York, we're seeing sort of the legacy of the 12 Bloomberg years, years in which homelessness has risen, right? Like 70%, I'm sure a picture of the homeless will speak to that. Where like 1/3 of the city has been rezoned, right? Where the average rent in Brooklyn went up 8% in 1 year last year and is now $3,000 for a 1 bedroom, right? So like we're living a really harsh legacy right now, and one that I think it feels really hard to intervene in. So, which is also sort of what I want to talk about. So we have this city that has become, you know, there's been like an 18% increase in like hotel units that have been built, right? So we have like hotels being built and luxury condos being built. We've lost affordable housing. It's something, I think the number I have written down is that from 2000 to 2012, about 18,500 apartments were destabilized, right? So we're talking about like, thousands of units that have been destabilized at the same time that we have all these increase in hotel units. So we know, and we live here, right? So we know like who the city feels like it's for right now, right? So to me, this is always sort of like, well, what do we do about this? And I think one of the things that has been really frustrating in watching what's happened in the past 12 years in New York is that there's been and there still aren't, like, so few answers about how we can actually change these processes. We've seen people get involved in zoning wars, right? Like, don't rezone my neighborhood. And we've seen that often fail, right? The Barclays Center is a striking example of that, right? So I think this is a really good, interesting moment to be having this discussion about what we do. I'm not one to ever place my confidence in elected officials. I'll just say that. But that said, I think coming at the end of this 12 years, right, and taking stock of where we're at right now is really important, and then taking stock of what we can do moving forward, right? So I think, like, with a new administration, I think we really, this is a chance for those of us who are interested in making the city a more common place, with more commons, but also just a more affordable place, a more livable place, right? This is a time, I think this is a really crucial time to take action. So to that end, I wanted to also talk about two projects I'm involved in that I believe will hopefully in some way intervene into these processes. So one is a project in Crown Heights that I'm just getting off, both these projects I'm just getting off the ground. So, but a project in Crown Heights, that's an oral history project, so I'm an oral historian as well as an anthropologist. And the oral history project is called The Changing Neighborhood, and it's really a way to start conversations about these processes. So another thing I think that has happened in New York is that we talk about these processes in certain spaces like this, and we talk about them with our friends, but how we can have wider conversations, right, about what's happening, and also to document the process of neighborhood change. If you've ever lived in a place where there's been a business one day, and then 3 weeks later there's another business, and then 3 months later you can't remember what was there, right? Or they like tear something down, and a year later you're like, what was here before they put that new fancy glass luxury condo that seems mostly empty? Like, what was here before then? So really thinking about how neighborhoods, when they change in these ways, they also disappear, like that there's disappearing histories that go with them. So the Crown Heights Oral History Project is trying to both document as well as start a conversation about these processes, and then hopefully from starting conversations, both with like longer-term residents and new residents, to talk about how these processes affect both of them, to build together, to intervene into the actual process. So that's the Crown Heights project. But I also want to talk about the New York City Anti-Eviction Network. So the New York City Anti-Eviction Network is also just getting off the ground. But I think one of the things about housing activism in New York has been that there's a real lack of housing activism that uses direct action tactics in order to achieve its goals. So there isn't a direct action housing campaign in New York right now. And there are actually direct action housing campaigns in other cities. San Francisco comes to mind, Chicago comes to mind, Barcelona comes to mind, Berlin comes to mind. So it's really, this idea is borrowing from those other cities, where there are people thinking about how can we use tactics of direct action to really take back the land, the apartments, the spaces that we've lost. And how can a campaign using direct action tactics go alongside maybe other projects, like legislating better rent stabilization laws, or something like that, but really starting from the ground and thinking about neighborhoods and what community control of neighborhoods would look like if we didn't keep saying like, oh, well, the rents just keep going up because that's a natural process and my apartment's not stabilized, so there's nothing I can do about it, right? Because when we keep thinking that way, we get really stuck in a box. So how do we sort of blow apart that stuff and think more broadly and more radically? And so the New York City Anti-Eviction Network, like I said, is borrowing from these other sort of cities. And our mission, I'll read the mission statement, is to strengthen neighborhood capacity to prevent evictions and to build community control of housing based on need, not profit. And I think we really envision this as being based in neighborhoods, first of all. So based on neighborhood by neighborhood sort of need, right? But also based in direct action tactics. So when I say direct action tactics, I mean things like eviction blockades, right? I mean things like squatting. I mean things like using direct democracy, right? To let the people who actually live in these places take control over the processes that happen in them. So I guess like what I think is important here is that the campaign is really thinking, or the Anti-Eviction Network is really thinking about how we can work outside of appealing to existing political structures. Because what I think we've learned in the past 12 years is that the existing political structures exist to maintain property in one form, right? And to maintain the property relations that let people who don't live in our neighborhoods, who rarely live in our neighborhoods, to profit from our neighborhoods, right? And to really think about control of the people who live in neighborhoods. So if you live in a place, then you have control over that place. It's kind of a really simple idea, right? But one that we've gotten very abstracted from. And I think that's a lot of the work of the project, is actually having that really simple idea become something that's true again. Right? That the places you live in, we can have control over. I think we've really lost control over the neighborhoods we live in, the apartments we live in, the city we live in. I don't know how long I've been talking, but time check? Yeah, I'm gonna wrap up. And I apologize, I'm the only person without fancy pictures. So like, but it's good because it's the beginning, so you have to concentrate the most, right? Or you still like have the ability to concentrate the most. Yeah, and I think the real goal of the project would be to ultimately decommodify property, right? So ultimately to change this common sense notion that property relations are commodified relations, right? If you ask me like how this looks, right? I can tell you that to me, and I'm not the only person at all who's working on this, and some of the other people who are working on it are here, and I might make them say things later on. But to me, this looks like I said, eviction blockades, right? And then eviction blockades leading into you not paying your rent anymore and saying like, I control this property, right? And then that leading into your whole building working with you to say like, this is our property and we're not paying our rent anymore, and like we're effectively squatting here, right? And then that leading to a general decommodification of the neighborhood, or at least devaluing of the neighborhood, because all of a sudden it looks a lot harder to invest private equity capital into that neighborhood because you have a lot of radical tenants who aren't going to really cooperate, right? And so it's like one small, I think, not even small, maybe big idea, but thinking about how we also devalue these properties around us, right? Like, how do they have so much value? Why do they have so much more value when, like, I don't live here anymore because this person has more money than me? Like, how can we sort of also have control over those processes? So I can talk more about how we're trying to, like, oppose this, what we consider the corporate control of our city right now. But Yates and Christina also told me that I'm starting because I'm pushing this like radical point, so like, you know. So I'll stop there. Yeah. And I guess I can answer questions, because I know that comes off as slightly vague, but yeah, we can talk more.
No, for visionary is the better word. Decommodifying entire neighborhoods. And also, for folks who may have just come in, there's a sheet going around for people who'd like updates on the New York Anti-Eviction Network, so look out for it there. So next, we're going to have Killian from Design
he's over
Agency.
Hi everyone, my name is Killian Riano. I am an architect. I'm just curious, how many architects are here? How many trained architects? And this is the architecture, and an architecture school has sponsored this. This shows somewhat problems. Usually whenever I'm presenting to more political audiences and talking about politics, usually there aren't very many architects, and it always makes me curious. So a little bit, just similarly to Marissa, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal story, which is I was born in Bogota, Colombia. I'm an immigrant to the US. I moved here when I was 12 years old. I moved to Miami, to a working class, lower working class neighborhood, Hispanic neighborhood. And I think that sometimes my immigrant experience gives me a little bit of skepticism to too many local things. Because if things are too local, do I belong there? I'm not local. Even when I go to Bogota, I'm no longer local. I'm now something else. I'm a little bit global. I'm a process. Becoming a citizen is a process. It brings up systems. And I'm here to talk to you about a couple of projects I have done. So my perspective might not be as local, but it is a perspective of, I'm an architect that has been experimenting and trying to think about how do you build these commons? What is the role of form? What is the role of processes, communities? How do you design for communities that are ever changing? But like Marissa said, that does not mean that certain groups are always gonna be at the losing end of that change. So I begin always saying design as politique because it's design as an agent to bring collectives, to create collectives, and try to come up with agendas. So this is the way we work. This is design agencies, a practice I started. We straddle worlds. We do anything from art, urbanism, activism, whatever the project says we should do, we do. We do critical co-creation, so we actually engage with communities in a critical manner, always questioning and talking about issues of authorship, the role of the designer, how much, and hopefully this moves beyond participation. Let's sit around and move benches on a map to talking about real issues that affect communities and try to come up with creative, and I wouldn't call them solutions, because I don't think there are many issues that don't have solutions, but interventions, movements, processes. Agonism, always looking at conflict. I believe that the most political thing that we can constantly do is point out conflict wherever it exists. Conflict means power, power dynamics, and always having an emergent aesthetic, never coming in saying this is what we're gonna do, but having that emerge through the process. I'm gonna show very quickly 4 projects. So that means that it's less than 2 minutes per project. Stay with me and I'll talk about them. 3 of them are housing, 2 of them were not built, 1 of them is built, and 1 is an activism public space project here in New York. Most of them are in Latin America, but I think that's important. In one case you'll see, for example, some of the natural alliances that, for example, some of the people getting gentrified here in New York are gonna have to people in Colombia. There's a woman that sells flowers down my street. I'm sure that she's Latino herself, and I'm sure a lot of those flowers came from Colombia, and a lot of those flowers were produced by people that were in similar conditions of poverty and oppression. So I'm gonna be presenting projects in Tijuana, Granada, Nicaragua, Facatativá, Colombia, and here in New York. And these, I wanna, less than focusing on the actual project, I'm just gonna take away 1 lesson from each. In Tijuana, expect change. This idea of immigration. Tijuana is a place where a lot of Central Americans and South Americans go to work only for a little in the TV factories. Share resources. In Nicaragua, we created, and you'll see it's more formal, but a way to share resources by design. Fuck with systems. In Facatativá, we use form to begin to mess with debt and housing processes, and always question power. That's the project we did here for the most part. So first in Tijuana. This is the condition of Tijuana. You probably have seen this picture in the past. On the left is the Tijuana River estuary. On the right is the city of Tijuana. And what you don't see is that right after this image, there's a gigantic hill that raises up into the landscape. That's where a lot is land that is, because it's desert, is not really buildable. A lot of people that come here to work in the TV factories, las maquiladoras, end up living in that area. Every time it rains, basically houses come down, everything floods, and obviously ecologists don't understand natural, man-made borders, so a lot of that goes right into the American side, and although, you know, obviously not to lessen the human crisis, it creates an ecological crisis as well. This is a little bit of that map. So in this case, what I proposed, thinking about some of these things, and immigration, ecologies, was a very loose way to create a safe way to build within that context, but allow for an ever-changing landscape. This is a housing project. There are, does this have? No. This is, oh, you can't really see it. So there will be two, everything in this place will be only about dealing with ecology. That's the constant. The constant is creating an urbanism that revolves around how to deal with water. The issue that many times creates crisis in this place, among many other things, but ecologically. And then the housing itself being a very loose and ever-changing condition. What that allows, this stopped working. Okay, I'm gonna get up. Okay, I'll try to move faster here. So you see that? So this would be the main area. The houses would plug in there. This was where services like light, electricity, water would be. And what this game allows, you know, a way to create also community resources as a way of entertainment, is to create this type of scenario where houses that are built all in prefab manners and allowing to create a micro community as people live, a micro economy of housing materials, things that can be recycled, exchanged. As someone that came from Honduras goes back home because their job is done, they can sell pieces of their houses, or they can give pieces of their houses in return of other things. So creating microeconomies that would allow for ever-changing kind of landscapes and solidarities along the entire mountains area. The second one is share resources. This was in Granada, Nicaragua. Granada is one of the most touristic areas of Nicaragua. This is Lake Nicaragua here. It's a colonial city. Along this path, there are a lot of native Nicaraguans, people of native descent, and there's just that have been just oppressed by these processes. So what we did there, we were working with a cooperative within the community itself to create a master plan that was all based around the main resources, trees. This is in the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, which is the same corridor that goes through Costa Rica. And so what we created instead of a hard master plan was a set of rules, a basic set of rules that could be just explained to people. Not something that was hard on paper. So here you create a line, you move that line, it's very kind of simple. And then you map the trees. We didn't know where actually each tree was. So we looked at trees as resources and things to plan or housing around it. And also many of these are actual ways to feed, ways to sell. There are a lot of tamarindo trees, so a lot of sweets from tamarindo, drinks, etc. And then once you do that, you begin to organize the housing. And the housing was built in a way that 4 houses would share space. They would become micro-political units, making decisions together. And then there was 3 scales of political units here. This is, at the very least, they would have to share their roof, and each of them collecting water, collecting the resources. The house is being built. The house, I love this image because the tree's right there. So I didn't control this. This was just made, and it actually, at least the image shows that it did something. An interior of the house. We also messed around with the way that the houses were constructed to be able to make houses that they can build 4 to 5 more rooms out of. So it was a basic framework, always with the idea of constants and variables, things that are safe, but then people can build up upon it. And we also helped the community itself start its own construction business. So they built their own houses, and with a tractor that was an investment from an American, we created 2 economic units. And in this area now controls its own resources. They're now renting these tractors to the city. So the city wouldn't even go there to fix their road. I mean, one of the saddest things I've ever heard is that whenever it rained here, people had to be taken in hammocks to the hospital. By controlling the tools and resources, they actually were giving the state the service. Fuck with systems, this is Facatativa, Colombia. Have you guys seen Maria Full of Grace? Well, for those of you who have seen it, it's supposed to be filmed here. It was actually filmed in Ecuador. It's actually not filmed in Colombia because they couldn't afford the insurance. But this is a city where it's about 30 minutes away from Bogota, and it's actually where my grandparents and a lot of my family still lives. But it's surrounded by the flower industry. Bogota is cold year-round, kind of like the weather we've had today. This is the weather in Bogota, 365 days. So to grow flowers here, you need a lot of water, and you need greenhouses, because the cold will kill the flowers. So it's an ecological disaster, really. And also, it attracts people from some of the areas affected by war. So it attracts people for Valentine's Day and Mother's Day here. I'll go into it a little bit, but just a little bit of reference here. This is the flowers. This is what Facatativa looks like. I just love this, showing this. This is the urban footprint of the entire town, and this is how much the flower industry takes. So they are actually taking more of their local resources. They're killing the land, taking the water, etc. So here we were approached by a collective of 50, what is called in Colombia strata. Colombia is stratified in social classes. This was a group of strata 1 and 2, the poorest of the stratas, to help them build a small housing community. This is the way that Colombia is building housing right now. It's back-to-back, kind of townhouse style. So what we decided is to try to think about how we could bring the patio typology from Colombian and Spanish kind of history into these. So what we created was these internal courtyards that would bring light. But what it allowed is to create a 3rd floor here, because they would have to come up. And a 3rd floor that would be shared. So what we try to create here is to think about how to create an internal courtyard that was also an economic opportunity. An economic opportunity to also begin to think about the subsidy system in Colombia. In Colombia, the government gives 50% of the value of a house to a family. Then they have to take 25% is a savings, and the other 25% is a loan. So what we wanted to do through this courtyard is to begin to think about how can we collectivize and begin to mess with that system. How can we turn these small little economic areas into ways to take all these loans and actually turn them into small economic units. This is, along with this project, it began as housing, but ended up being actually kind of a little bit of an activist project, looking at the flower industry and thinking about the global aspects of it, also thinking of the privatization of the city. One thing that I've always said is that before, Facatativa is a typical kind of loss of the Indies design city. Had the central court, plaza, which was the central public space. Now the public space is the parking lot of Carrefour. Which, for those of you who don't know, is a Walmart, right? It's basically the French Walmart. So thinking about how basically, wrapping up. And finally, the idea of question power. This project is Who Owns Space. It was a project after Occupy Wall Street started, in which we invited a lot of people to explore this question. What does it mean to use space excessively? This is an actual placard that was up on, I think, 60 Wall Street. And so it was a project to look at and think about these issues. It was a collective of groups, which I'm really happy about. It was a way to reveal conflict, question conflict, advocate against it, wherever, and intervene in other ways. We did things like create these maps that show where privately owned public spaces were. And even public spaces, both processes need to be rethought, because the public right now, I think there's the sense of, with a lot of the things that we're talking about, there's an inherent critique that the state is not working, that we cannot think of processes, they're not responsive, there's no money. Post-80s, the state no longer does anything. We also did workshops in which we invited people out. We did this with Paula Siegel from 596, where we created these small little vignettes of all the rules that were being broken in Zuccotti Park, and pointing out that this is not a free ride. This is actually a deal they made with the public, that they can go higher and have more rentals, and they are supposed to then give us the public space. Then we invited people to submit complaints. And the New York Civil Liberties Union and other legal groups came together, and then, yeah. So finally, I wanted to end with a few questions, and some of these are the things that I've been thinking. A lot people have been thinking and talking about recently. A lot. I've been to like 2 or 3 events where things like about gentrification are coming up. How many of these projects are being commodified, co-opted? What is the race and gender makeup? What does it mean to have a horizontal system? And how do you structure it so that you always make sure that the loudest don't always get what they want all the time, but that there's an amount of equity and actual fairness? Because it's something that happens in horizontal systems. The loudest just get what they want. And etc. Privilege, the idea of land versus housing, activism versus entrepreneurship, a lot of the issues that are coming up around these things. So this is just a list of questions I have for us to chat.
Hi, my name is Benedict Lewis. I work with a research unit at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. It's called C-Lab, and it's a group that works on communication about matters of public concern in cities and in buildings. And so the project I'm presenting today is it's a collaboration. Oops, thanks. Excellent. All right. So I'm just going to go through this project, and maybe you can kind of tell me what it has to do with the commons. We can just sort of open it up to discussion later, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview of what we're doing. So this project, LA Open Acres, it's a project we're doing with 596 Acres, which you may know about, which Killian mentioned, Paula Siegel, also with a group in LA called Community Health Councils, which is a grassroots community health organizing project. And so LA Open Acres, it's a platform that is an online platform and also a set of organizing tools and an organizing initiative in LA that looks at vacant land in LA and maps vacant land and creates an online publicly accessible database of all of the vacant lots in LA, and a set of resources that allows people, anyone who has access to the web, to make plans with their neighbors for how to use these spaces. So this is data which the city has, but has never actually been compiled before. LA, most of the publicly owned vacant lots are divided up between 5 different departments. It's siloed. They've never actually combined their data sets, much less made it publicly available. So this is an initiative with these groups, and C-Lab is working on the urban and spatial analysis for this. 596 Acres is doing a lot of the work to bring it into an online format, and CHC is really doing the on-the-ground organizing of the project. So these are some of the issues that we wanted to address. In LA, there's a 12-year difference in how long people live in neighborhoods, which is a greater gap in life expectancy than the US and North Korea. So in a single city, there's that much inequality in public health. And a lot of that has to do with environmental health and the kind of access that people have to different types of spaces for recreation in their neighborhoods. So the second point, health happens long before the hospital. It's about the environments that we live in and the communities that we make. So there are a lot of communities, especially in South LA, that are extremely park poor. So in South LA, there's 1.2 acres of parkland per 1,000 people versus 75 acres citywide. And because of that also, or it's sort of a separate but related issue, there aren't a lot of healthy options for food in those neighborhoods also. But those same areas are actually disproportionately affected by vacant land, and that's both publicly owned vacant land and also privately owned vacant lots. So this project is, this is just a graph to show there's a great inequality between West LA, which is a wealthier area of the city, and South LA. So this project is about using open data to open up spaces. So to give people access to information about where publicly owned vacant land is, which are the organizations in the city that own it, also where are privately owned vacant lots, and what's a procedure and what is a set of methods that you can use to organize to gain access to that lot, to create a community garden, to create a space for doing events, to create an urban farm. And so the toolbox that we're creating, it's a map and database of vacant publicly owned land and privately owned land. It includes parcels of land. So it could be, for instance, that like the city took some piece of land by eminent domain to make a highway, and then they never made that highway, so now that's vacant. Or it could be that they planned to do a water treatment plant, and then they chose another site for that water treatment plant. It also includes easements, which is like, for instance, easements under power lines where the city has taken pieces of land. That could also be used for farming. Excess roadway, meaning that areas around the roadway that could be used for public uses. There are a lot of what are called pork chops, which are these kind of triangular pieces of land because LA is such an automotive-driven city. So where you have this kind of triangular traffic pattern, there's a leftover piece of land in the middle. So those are all going to be part of this database that we're putting online that people will be able to access. We're also doing particular like wiki-style pages that are profiles of each of those lots and links to network partners and a land access toolkit so that people will actually have information that they can use to, because most people don't have that much experience organizing around land use issues. So we're providing also a toolkit just to get people started on that. And then offline, because we think it's really obviously important too, because insofar as there are these great inequalities in access to public space in LA, there are obviously also inequalities in who has access and facility and feels comfortable accessing these resources online. So we're also doing a lot of offline work, and this is something that CHC, this partner in LA, is particularly picking up. But they're doing a lot of organizing. They're doing a series of workshops in vacant lots, and then also working with what's called the neighborhood councils, which are these kind of community representative quasi-governmental bodies that were set up after I believe after the Watts uprising. So this is 596 Acres, which maybe you know it, maybe you don't. It's a fantastic website initiative of Paula Siegel. Is Paula here yet? She may be coming. But this was the first version of it, you could say, in New York, which launched, I think, in 2011. It's similar to the project that we're working on in LA, and a lot of what we're doing is kind of built on this model. And what this does is identifies all of the publicly owned vacant land in the city. And so you can go on this now, you can find lots in your neighborhood if you want to create a community garden. And I think they've opened 16 formerly vacant lots to community uses since it launched in 2011. And this is the second iteration of this that 596 Acres is working on now with city government in Philadelphia called Grounded in Philly. Similar project. The beautiful thing about this actually is that Philadelphia has a very kind of aggressive approach to dealing with landlords who are behind on their taxes and otherwise not taking care of their properties. So this actually has not only publicly owned vacant lands, but all that brown that you see there is privately owned vacant lots that the city is trying to exert influence on these landlords to turn it over to community uses. So that in LA, likewise, we'll have both publicly and privately owned vacant lots. This is the current state. So before it launches, this is the website, laopenacres.org. Right now, it's just a blog. Once we actually have the data, we'll start dropping data into an interactive map similar to the ones on these other websites. But this is just sort of, we have some stories about vacant lots, some guest contributions from people who are organizing around open space in LA. These are signs that were designed by C-Lab. And so these are lots of potential, lots of opportunity. This is, again, trying to kind of close the gap between the physical space of the city and these online organizing tools. So these will actually be placed on vacant lots so that even if you don't know about the website, if you're walking around in your neighborhood, you see a sign, you can get connected to the site, get connected to resources, figure out who the owner is, if it's the Department of Water or a private owner. So this is just showing how they would be like filled in. And then this is some of our preliminary mapping. C-Lab is working on the mapping of vacant lots. We're working with a number of city departments who have catalogs of their own their vacant land. So this is our first iteration of the citywide map. In red, you see, or pink, it's privately owned vacant land. Purple, which you probably can't see at this scale, is publicly owned vacant land, and green is current park space. So this is one of the neighborhood council districts. Just to show you here, there's a lot of privately owned vacant land, a few publicly owned sites like that, for instance. This in purple here, this is one of these easement corridors that's for power lines. So there are acres and acres of land of easements. And so this is our estimate right now of how much land there is in LA that could be turned to community purposes. And a lot of this in the publicly owned land, the city's already aware of and is actually actively trying to find partners to turn this over to, because it's not really land that they can maintain either. So we're hoping that with this site and with the partnership with CHC, that we're essentially providing tools that can kind of spread this information and democratize access to open land in LA.
Caroline?
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. I thought I would start by seeing how many people here are currently researching or learning about community land trusts. Raise your hand if you are. Okay, so maybe half the room. And what about actively organizing around community land trusts? Okay, so we have like five people. And then what about maybe someone who is living in a space that's supported by a community land trust? Yes, okay. So it's not just a dinosaur, it's possible. So I thought I would talk really quickly so that we could move into discussion about why I'm so excited to start actively organizing around community land trusts, and so that we have a lot of time to hear from Picture the Homeless about all the work that they've been doing. So one more question. How many people here know where they're going to live next year? Maybe a third of the room. So I think this is the big problem in New York. I'm an artist, and I also organize infrastructure lately because I started realizing that I was making these short-term projects, but my entire identity and everything I could imagine was coming out of this very precarious situation where I managed to go to Cooper Union and not have the kind of debt that my peers had, but I was still moving all the time. So even though I wanted to make so-called community-based work, I was not based in a community because I was moving. And beyond that, most of my peers couldn't even imagine what it would be like to commit to working on being based in a community. So I thought I would show these projects that led up to getting really excited about community land trusts, and then we can move towards Picture the Homeless and discussion. Can you click on this? So I guess for me, I've made very short-term things like public seating just by attaching seats to stop sign posts in the city, seeing those holes in the metal as an opportunity to attach something, and then maintaining it. I've made things like a police barricade that you flip over and turn into a bed. So that's an open source kit if you want to know how to do it. But I started thinking, what if all these projects were not just short term? And what if all of our proposals were not a journey to someplace else? This friend of mine, Susan Jahota, says that all the time, and I think it's really important if you're in school or if you're teaching, if you're making proposals a lot, to not imagine that you can always see what you're doing as a journey towards a better future. Like, what if you had to actually accept that what you do on a daily basis is your work, and the way you deal with materials and labor is actually the world that you're reproducing? So I started thinking, how can I make projects about sustainability if I just throw them out at the end of the day? And what does it mean that the people that I look up to as artists are landlords who subsidize their work by charging high rent and employing interns that they don't pay? Like, that's not the kind of art world that I want to be part of. So if you can click on ourgoods.org. In 2008, 4 friends and I started this barter network to start thinking about how all the skills that are in the city could be used to support each other to make projects even if we don't have enough money. So if you click on something that someone has, you'll see there's a list of haves and needs, and anyone can join the site. The idea is that we start putting people in touch with each other to help each other get their projects done without money. And from there, we realized that it doesn't have to be a one-to-one barter, that lots of people want to teach skills, and that we could have a barter-based education platform where if you offer to teach a class, your students could meet your needs by giving you services or goods rather than money. So that led to a bunch of people starting trade school. If you click on the next link, it's just tradeschool.coop. So we run as a collective, and Zubalski made open source software so that anyone can coordinate barter-based classes anywhere in the world. If they want to use our website, they can. They can also organize it offline, obviously. So if you go to tradeschool.coop, you can see this learning platform. And from there, I started thinking, why is it that people like me are so interested in making individual efforts and not being good allies to connect efforts across the city? Why is it that we keep saying, oh, time banking versus barter versus complementary currencies, all of these things that have similar potential members are somehow factions instead of real supporters in a larger movement? So I found out about this group called Solidarity NYC, and I helped make this map of groups that are doing things that we consider related to the solidarity economy. So groups that organize collectively, that think about sustainability and social justice. And if you go on the map, you can see groups we've identified, from CSAs to time banking. So that was one way to try and see cross-sector dialogue as powerful, and through that I met Jesse Riley at Banks NYC, and now we do Our Goods and Banks NYC events together, so that we recognize that time banking and barter are allies, not in competition. So from there, I thought I would say, how many people in this room are either in school, teaching, or working at a school? Raise your hand if you are. So I think this is really important because a lot of people have pointed out that what it means to be in New York City when you're in school is that tuition rises every year, and it's a commodity that will expand and expand and expand, and somehow it doesn't seem to be related to any market. We continue to accept debt, even though there's $1 trillion of it. We haven't had that kind of crisis yet, but it's coming. Yes, and we're all paid nothing, but we're buying into a system that's reproducing people who wait for a future rather than looking at how they use their labor right now. And we're changing New York City because New York City is becoming a college, if not a hotel or a condo. So this is our responsibility, and I think it's important to not just research these ideas, but see how we are living them and making them right now. So while I think it's important to dream up alternatives and create ways to heal and know how to belong to one another, I think we have to be serious about the resist, occupy, create model, so that you resist eviction and actually see your neighborhood as your neighborhood, go to your community board meetings and actually know what's going on, and then occupy spaces if you can, like 596 acres, and create healing alternatives, seeing them all as linked together so that it's not one versus the other. It's not direct action versus a policy change, but see that we're all allies and that we do see a New York City that's worth living in, that we actually want to stay in forever. So after doing these efforts around labor and materials and learning, I started thinking, what would it be like if I knew that I was going to live in a neighborhood for 60 years? What if I knew that when I was 90, I could have 60-year-long relationships with people, or I didn't have to make barter contracts because we were clearly in relationship of mutual aid, and we could rely on one another and actually grow old together? So then I realized, well, that's never going to happen because no one around me knows where they're going to be next year. So how can I trust them? How can I really build a relationship? You know? And so we go around being very contractual or wanting to make visible the gifts that we give because we don't actually have friends and neighbors in the way that we might want. And so I thought, okay, the only thing I've heard about so far that might move towards this is decommodifying land. Like, what if instead of getting money for grants, we actually got land? What if we used the money that we got to make sure that we could actually stay in neighborhoods, and that being an artist didn't mean that you had to be rich? Like, what does it mean if the only artists in New York City are artists who are wealthy enough to afford rent in these neighborhoods? There are so many artists that are being displaced, and I think that as an artist, we could see the move from cultural to financial capital as one that pushes the city to rethink what it does with land. And we could see what we're doing as something that makes the city more beautiful, where you don't just have to be a rich artist in order to live here. So for me, it's really important that we move towards organizing. And I thought I would close with this quote that I really like, which is that action without reflection is blind, and reflection without action is impotent. So action without reflection is blind. If we just try and build this community land trust without doing research or learning about it, we'll probably run into a lot of walls or get killed. And reflection without action is impotent. So if all we do is dream about models that somebody else should enact, or just read about things and get cynical about how impossible it is, we will be impotent. So I think we need to find this fusion, and hopefully this is a space where it can be about praxis, about learning and action. And we can recognize that there are a lot of people in this room who may be moved here and want to stay, or who could go home and think about what it means to be place-based and really know their neighbors. But whatever the case, this is New York City right now. It is a college. And if we don't have any commitment to each other, then we're not going to be able to organize well. So that's why I'm so glad that you guys are here, and I hope we can move towards organizing.
My name is Scott Andrew Hutchins, and I ran up $60,000 in student loan debt at the College of Staten Island, and I couldn't find work. I'm medically limited to a desk job, and eventually I got evicted. And when I was concerned about the conditions in the shelter system, I discovered Picture the Homeless on October 4th, 2012, and I have been an active member ever since. At Picture the Homeless, we have two major committees, one on civil rights and one on housing, and I've primarily been involved in the latter. We also do voter registration, housing organizing academy, education, and job and leadership development. We are founded by homeless people and led by homeless and formerly homeless people. We believe homeless people must be involved in every political decision that affects them. Picture the Homeless organizes to fight the root causes of homelessness, and one of the causes is a dysfunctional housing policy that prioritizes profit over community needs. The Department of Homeless Services budget last year was $950 million. Each shelter monthly receives between $3,000 and $4,000 for each resident, and the resident in turn receives a cot and a locker, maybe hot water, there was none this morning, and maybe some food. I didn't get breakfast this morning. So that's why we're trying to create and preserve truly permanently affordable housing in New York City for the lowest income New Yorkers, and community land trusts are part of this. And so what a community land trust is a nonprofit community-based organization that takes and controls to hold land in perpetuity for the good of the community. They act as stewards of the land and leasing it out to ensure housing stays permanently affordable, usually for a period of 99 years. And it's not specifically for housing necessarily. It can also be used for community gardens, community centers, arts venues. Commercial space is a major way that we would fund the community land trust. We get a mom and pop business, and the revenue that they would generate would help to fund the lower income people in the community land trust. And the purpose is to take the land off the private market, put it in the community's hands, and take the price of land out of the price of housing. And by putting it out of reach of speculators, housing can remain affordable forever. A community land trust has a tripartite board of directors, 1/3 of which are the residents of the CLT, another third are residents of the surrounding community, and the last third is housing experts who are advisors, and that would include academics, public officials, and so forth. And every development member of a CLT has to abide by a social development platform ensuring permanent affordability. And there's a basic model, and it's very flexible and can be adapted to different communities' needs. You can be very conservative models that involve government input. And I understand there's one in Chicago where they are on a communistic model and they only accept gifted land. So our interest in community land trust came several years ago. We tried to push the city to pass legislation called Intro 48, which would mandate an annual comprehensive count of all vacant property in New York City. And Christine Quinn seriously blocked this. She said it would cost millions and millions of dollars. She really wouldn't let it come to a vote. And she basically said there really aren't a lot of vacancies in New York. And Picture the Homeless counted the 20 community boards that we felt were most blighted by vacancy in New York City, and we found enough space to house 200,000 people which is 4 times the current shelter population, and we did this on a budget of a little over $1,000. Because these properties aren't being utilized, we want to engage people from these communities to get involved in reclaiming land and make housing affordable for people in these communities. We held a couple of summits. The first one was in April and another in July, in which we actually formulated a coalition of progressive nonprofits, community members, academics, and homeless people called the New York City Community Land Initiative. This group has 4 work groups: education and outreach, case study, governance, and policy and legislation. And I've been actively involved myself in education and outreach and case study. And the education and outreach work group, part of what we've done is to make some of these, we've done more than you're actually seeing, but a lot of that's part of what the case study group does. But a lot of these things that you're seeing, these are instructional materials that we collaborate with artists and graphic designers. And most of the ideas you see in these came from homeless people, some of whom have advanced degrees like I do. And it was basically us and the staff and a couple advisors, and we met with these people, and the graphic designers created what you see here based on our input. And now we're starting a pilot project in East Harlem. East Harlem was chosen, well, first I want to tell you, we went to Cooper Square, which is an existing community land trust here. And what they did in 1959 was they started a mutual housing association, and that's what really grabbed people for the community land trust, because the community land trust is only about land, whereas the mutual housing association actually deals directly with the buildings. And so that's what grabbed people, and they ended up with a community land trust later. And so we also worked with another group called Catch that actually involves several mutual housing associations in the city. So we chose to approach East Harlem because they're dealing with rent-stabilized housing that's expiring, and they're failing cooperatives and tenant-controlled housing such as HDFCs and TILs, and which are at risk of falling into the hands of developers and into the private market. We also have a relationship with community groups and political allies such as Community Voices Heard and East Harlem Preservation. So we've begun the process of reaching out to residents and building relationships. And our eventual goal is to build a citywide CLT network that would support different CLTs around the city. We're trying to educate other communities and grassroots organizations. After East Harlem, our plan is to work with South Bronx, Bed-Stuy, and the rest of Harlem on CLTs so they can apply these ideas to the needs of their neighborhoods. And so basically, what Cooper Square did was they basically had decades of organizing, and they've had to do this continually because they've had issues, and it's not just something they did in the 60s, but it's something they're continually doing now. But the average income of a resident of Cooper Square, which is around the Cooper Union area, it's based around 4th Street, but there are other buildings throughout the Lower East Side. The average income of a resident there is $12,000, and they're paying $3,000 to $4,000 a month in rent. $300 to $400 in rent? A month in rent. Oh yeah, $300 to $400 in rent. That makes sense. Okay, yeah, $300 to $400 in rent per month in Manhattan. So our goal is to try to spread this around, try to basically acquire as much land as we can, and eventually basically provide housing for all residents, eventually defund DHS, and put all that money into community land trust so that we can abolish the shelter system and get everyone living in suitable housing, which is a human right.
Great. Well, that was another awesome visionary note to end the presentations on. And I wonder if before opening it up to other folks in the room, with just a couple of things, I think there was a real diversity of approaches and tactics discussed in the various presentations, and this question of how you weave them together, I think, is really Or if you want to just go straight into questions, remarks, or insights from other people working on this set of issues. So, any internal? Okay, well let's.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Question for the last speaker. The way in which you were talking about Cooper Square, it sounded as though it wasn't just the land that was in the community land trust, but also a building or buildings, correct?
The Community Land Trust is an organization that controls the use of the land, and it would work in collaboration with a mutual housing, mutual housing association, and so it's the mutual housing association would actually be involved with the buildings, and so that would have another board. Okay, in the situation with Cooper Square, they basically mobilized to take the housing that they were already occupying and try to keep it from being privatized and driving and mispriced. No, they were not squatting at this point. They were tenants at this point, and they got involved in legal battles. Do you think you could update them on this? Do you know more about this, Ryan?
I mean, this was done as part of a reaction to the urban renewal phase of Robert Moses and the gentrification of the Lower East Side. So there were landlords there, but a lot of landlords were also just right, exactly. So they organized, and through organizing and dealing with the city for decades and decades, they actually won control of the buildings, and afterwards they established the community land trust. Now the Major Housing Association collaborates with the community land trust.
Okay, let's let some other folks talk, or maybe.
Well, I just want to say that the effort for Cooper Square to become a mutual housing association community land trust started in 1959. It was not actually incorporated until 1972, so there was a very long battle to do this.
Of community land trust being formed?
There are a couple hundred community land trusts in the United States, and a lot of them do have community gardens, but whenever there are buildings on top of community land trusts, they are much lower.
Okay, it sounds like I have to stop my insurance and bring back. Thank you.
Technically, the MHA has a 99-year lease from the Community Land Trust. Community Land Trust owns the land, leases it to the Mutual Housing Association.
I'm from the UK. I'm currently working with a community trust project, how have you dealt with it when the community don't seem that keen on the new construction for that space? There's a massive list, like waiting list for new housing and options, but the neighbours who did a community consultation seem like they weren't really up for redevelopment. I mean, it's a tight site, but have you ever had any issues with that, where actually, even though it seems like a great idea, like, low affordable housing, because it's in a really dense area, it's kind of a bit of a tension?
Would you like to go into this, Ryan? Okay.
I mean, so we had a visit from the East London Community Land Trust recently, and they held this huge art space, but a lot of these buildings that we're focusing on are partly occupied and partly vacant. And so not only do community land trusts offer the opportunity to preserve building affordable housing, but also to create them. And of course, organizing and building to community is always difficult, especially one like Don Barrio, which has such a community feel to it and such a neighborhood feel to it. So it's going to be difficult.
vacancy or lower? If we were to find out that there was actually more vacancy than that through Eviction to Homeless's efforts, would that then invalidate New York's rent regulation?
In terms of legally speaking, I don't have an answer for that. Ethically, I think it does, but we would need to consult with a lawyer in terms of that issue.
Yes.
Yeah, I was basically raised in AS 220 because I'm from Rhode Island, and it was the first place that I could see that was working. And I think one of the reasons AS 220 is so amazing is that Bert, who is the director, is paid the same as the bartender, the janitor, the curator. Everyone is paid the same amount. So they take it to a very radical place where they're like, all labor is the same. And I do think that Fourth Arts Block, which is supported by the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, is a good example in the East Village of artists organizing together. It's not under one brand like AS 220 in the same way. There's a lot of diverse artist groups that organized starting in the 80s, but it's similar in that there's a lot of amazing groups there.
I didn't have anything more to add. I'm not familiar with that particular one. We've been familiar with several of them. There's one in Boston. I can't remember what it's called. And there's another one in Los Angeles. And we've been studying what they're doing. And we've been visited by groups from around the world. We had some visitors from Germany, for example, who are working on, and they're actually looking at what we're doing. They found us basically because of the internet, and they've been very interested in what we're doing.
I have a question. So I can imagine that after this, a lot of people are going to get really excited about joining Picture the Homeless. And I'm just wondering how, as a group, do you all decide what is helpful? Like, what is the balance between lots of visitors who want to know what you're doing and people who want to research what you're doing, and then actual organizing, because you only have so much time? Can you talk about how you negotiate that?
Well, we do welcome visitors. We don't want them to just walk in on us, but obviously, but the major issue, because we get called about, people want the data from the housing count, and that's not something we want to give up, because it means they're probably a speculator, and that's the last person we want getting that information. So our meetings are more or less open. We do want people to contact us before approaching us, but yeah, this can go more into that. Do you have any more to say, Alex?
Well, basically, it's like Scott just said, that we don't want them just walking in on us, but technology is, it's really worldwide, so people see us, they get referrals from different people and work that we're doing, and that's how they get a chance to find out the stuff that we do, and they come and they sit in on our meetings and take notes. So it's nothing secret, what we're doing. It's just that they find what we're doing excellent.
Yeah, we've had people from Berlin, we've had someone from Budapest, we've had people from South Africa, so they're getting familiar with our work.
Yeah, cool. So I wanted to maybe push a little further on this question of the fact that there's such a great interest throughout the city. All these discussions are intensifying. Like, so many people showed up at this event right? There are other events all over the place in the city. And this question of, I mean, obviously a group like Picture the Homeless is on the front lines, on the ground, really like the type of work that that everyone should be supporting, right? But the question is, and I think just to reiterate what Caroline said, what are the best ways to support? How do you take all this energy that so many people have, particularly people with a lot of access to resources and privilege in the arts and academia and architecture, and what's the best way to channel those energies? It seems like research has been an important avenue. And I think we have some copies of this thing called the Militant Research Handbook that should be in the back as you're making your way out. But still, the question that comes up is that housing and the human right to housing and shelter are obviously the most urgent things, but we're seeing too that these can't be separated from larger questions, as Manissa was saying, community control of neighborhoods, right? Developing long-term relationships, forms of mutual aid, forms of mutual support. So housing is I'm just speaking for, housing seems the most urgent in terms of life or death, survival, struggles, but it's also almost like the tip of the iceberg in terms of really rethinking the whole city along the lines that people have been discussing. So that's that's I think a big question is, how do you plug in all this energy when what are the best ways to actually actualize that potential power that people have? And I think there's been a whole diversity of tactics spoken about here: research, design, art, developing alternative economies, all this stuff. But there's just the conversation keeps growing, and the question of what do you do with it, right? Besides the stuff that's already happening, how do you raise it up and support and amplify? So that's just a bigger kind of rambling question for people. Sorry for that. Peter, did you want to?
One way things can come together is around the role of the city and the political process in the city. The work that Picture the Homeless is doing and around community land trusts is going to be heavily dependent on support from the city of New York in a number of ways. One of the most important is getting units into the community land trust. The question that was raised about Cooper Square. The push is to get the city to commit to put any land or buildings into that come into the city's possession through tax foreclosure or other means, to put those into community land trusts and to take them permanently out of the profit-driven private market and make them available to local housing. That's going to involve some ordinances passed by the city council, and there are going to be campaigns to pressure the city council into going into it, to supporting that kind of activity. You heard Captain Wynn block some of the efforts already. It takes real pressure on the council to do that. And the potential is huge, because community land trusts can not only provide decent housing for people at affordable rent, but they're in a way very close to local neighborhood self-government. They can plan for a neighborhood. New York City has a thing called BIDs, business improvement districts, in which business owners can get together in a neighborhood and get public support for what they do and have an influence on the planning process. And there's no reason why there can't be residential bids in the same way, based on community land trusts that would in fact be the democratic way in which neighborhoods can govern themselves. So I think there'll be a lot of political activity, particularly with the new administration coming in. And mailing lists such as you're starting to get here is one important way of getting people out. But it takes political organization.
One of the major concerns with de Blasio's likely election is that some of his major campaign contributors have been people who run the charities that own the shelters. So that is going to be an obstacle for us.
Cool. Oh, yeah, please, Vanessa, go ahead.
Can I just say about the sort of, is this on? Can you guys hear me anyway? Oh, no, it's on. Okay. Can I just say, yeah, I've been hearing like this narrative a lot recently. I think that de Blasio is going to save us. And I think we have to be really, really careful about this narrative. I just want to say that here right now. I think the only way that de Blasio is going to save us is if we create the things we maybe want him to then save, right? So by that I mean, I think what actually needs to happen now that we have a new administration, finally, which is huge, I just like to say, because Bloomberg has been completely pro-real estate, right? So like you couldn't get anything through the city council that opposed that, I mean, at all. So like there was, 12 years of that is a long time for one city. So I think there is an opportunity. I'm not saying there's not an opportunity, but I feel really nervous about like complacency around de Blasio coming in and like actually doing the things he said he was going to do. I think we have a good model in Obama right now to like not trust that people are going to do the things that they say they're going to do. And I think the only way that things are actually going to change is if we create things on the ground that we want to see happen. And that's why like I think I'm really invested in using tactics of direct action to really not wait for the city council to pass something that we can then sort of say, yeah, okay, great, we had to work 4 years to get the city council to pass something, because also realistically when there's a new administration in New York, it takes 2 years for anything to happen, because they spend the first 2 years, reorganizing and, everything else. But really saying, like, okay, so you ran on a campaign that was about affordable housing, right? And you borrowed language from activists, like you borrowed a ton of language from activists in New York, right? And you ran on this campaign, and now look, we're doing the things that you said you wanted to happen, and now what are you gonna do about it? So I think that's where I see opportunity in New York right now. Yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there.
Part of the problem is that the definition of affordable housing was invented by Andrew Cuomo, and it's like 40 to 80% of AMI. I mean that.
Up to 160 actually.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's nothing. Yeah. Eight. Yeah. It's a number the vast majority of the current residents of New York can't even afford. So the calling it affordable housing is patently dishonest.
Just wanted to do a time check really fast. We're at 8:40 now, and I think the plan had been to go until 9. And so, so we can continue the discussion. And also, I wanted to ask Killian and Benedict, you guys, please chime in as we continue. Yeah.
So I guess I have a question that kind of bounces off the previous point. How do we ensure that these modes of activism aren't isolated? I understand the point that they need to operate outside of governance structures, but when you think about the power that the city does have to potentially create mass amounts of affordable housing, de Blasio's supposed plan is an 8-point plan to create, 120,000 units? But how do we sort of synchronize these methods across different governance structures, especially when you consider, like, for example, rent stabilization happens in Albany. It's controlled at the state level. So how can we think about how to scale these processes up? Because that's also really important, I think.
Yeah, I want to second that, because I've been going to some city council meetings lately, and I think that it really is important to go and see how these city council meetings happen and how they know that they can get away with things because people don't pay attention to what happens. And developers know, and when you go and you see like some of these big like ULURP decisions and you see related and how chummy they are with the city council people, it's because they have this relationship that's based upon years and years and years and years. And like what they're doing in Manhattan, what they're doing in the Bronx, what they're doing in Queens, like it's just a huge effort because of based on these relationships. So we could come and also try to interrupt in these relationships. And I think that having localized examples of solidarity is important, but I think it's also good, like we can walk into these, we can go to our community boards, we can go to our city council, we're allowed to go to these
Yes, we have a woman in the back.
However, it's really more important because what they say do count. Now, I know from CB10 in Harlem, a whole lot of crap is going on where the community is not notified about hearings relating to buildings or property in their community. I brought up the issue several times about the sanitization even of the minutes. Nothing was done by the borough president, who's now going to be the
Comptroller.
senior moment, I'm sorry. You know, just knowing that that person's moving over there makes me very nervous because he claims he did all these wonderful things in Manhattan. Well, I know what happened in Harlem. And basically the cultural integrity of the place has been torn apart. This has been primarily a political action, starting at the community board, because the people who are put on the community board are appointees. They are not elected by the community. Half of those people come from the borough president's office, and the other half come as a percentage of however the district lines are drawn within that particular community board. So in my board, 3 people came from Robert Jackson, and the rest of the half came from Inez Dixon. And we got what we got. And it's very unfortunate what has happened up there, because a lot more could have been done for the people based on how much money they make up there. You're talking about an AMI. AMI right now is about, I think 60,000, or maybe even 45. But if the people in the community are only making about $30,000, then all this so-called quote-unquote affordable housing, as it's described, they still can't afford to live in. Now, we have asked for something called income-targeted housing. That changes the whole description, and it makes it much clearer about what it is you're talking about. You're talking about the income of the people in that area. If the income of the people in that area is about $30,000 a year, or $20,000, whatever it is, then you try to build housing that these people can afford. And I don't mean junk housing, because they could do a lot better than what they do. They used to give the so-called 20% out of that 2080 baloney that they came up with. And what was happening is that, for example, even the faucet that your water came out of was different than the faucet in the rest of the building. So these were that's the kind of mischief that basically went on. You have a bad community board, you're going to get a bad result, and that's where it starts. And if you follow it through that ULIP process, you will see that everybody in the city council will vote as your council member. That's how they do it, because they want them to back them when they want something for their area. So it is very crucial that you look at who you elect to your community board. For some reason, unfortunately, my community still believes in Appalachian Power, who did look out for that community. And we wouldn't even have 2 subway stops there on the IND line if it wasn't for them. They're going to take the train straight from the Bronx right on down to 59th Street. I mean, these are the kinds of things he stood for, but they wouldn't let us work in a store called Blue Team on 25th Street. He came out and said, you don't shop when you can't work. I don't expect that out of any of our political people now. So people are still believing that your politician is going to protect you, and that's not what's happening. So, you know, we have to get into the frame of mind that we have to protect us. And one person spoke a moment ago, I think it was a lady, regarding the fact that you have to start developing structures and going to the politicians and saying, this is what we want, with a hell of a lot of people behind you while you're saying that, which means organizing, and a lot of you are organizing. And those of you who are not and want to do things in your community, you need to hook up and start learning how to organize, because really that's a whole skill to get people out and to get them to pay attention. So what you were saying about ULIP is very, very correct. The city planning board, when you show up there with the ULIP procedure, they listen to the developers. They act like they're doing you a favor to allow you as a community person to speak. But if you're not going along with what they want, they just basically ignore you and ask the developer questions. They don't ask the community questions, and we're rolling.
Cool. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Where's Marissa?
So this has been exactly that you can actually apply to put housing or to
I've never heard of that being part of a planning process in New York. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's not that it's you get like you don't get planning permission in the same way that you would in the UK for a project. Yeah, so that sounds fascinating. That it seems great. One thing I just wanted to say, just sort of to the last couple points about how we build momentum behind organizing initiative like that. I mean, I think that's what part of why we're interested in being involved in the project that I presented, or why I think community land trusts are important in general. A nice message that we got from people in Tahrir Square in the first month or so of Occupy Wall Street was to the point that it's not just the issues that are introduced, but also the spaces that are created that are important. And I think that's why it matters that people have say in how land in their neighborhoods are used, because land is actually a crucial resource for forming the types of social relationships that are necessary for advancing common interests. So that's why I think as architects we're invested in this as a project.
Yeah, that's how I answer it.
We also had a gentleman from.
We're gonna take a few more. We're about out of time, and I saw a lot of hands shoot up when we're talking. But we're only really have time for like a couple more, and then we're gonna ask folks to give final remarks. But so let's take 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, I just want to say real briefly, right? I studied that era with, the Lower East Side, what they did and whatnot. Since I've been homesteading, I learned that a lot of programs are not around like that
city kind of like took them away, and it made it really difficult for homesteaders like myself these days, because those programs, where they at for you know, homesteaders in this era, it's just not there. So along with a new administration coming in, it looks like folks will have to get together and continue to write legislation on bring back the Homestead Act, supposedly. I don't know, but all I can say is that I'm very frustrated that those programs are not really around today.
Okay, yeah, well, I just wanted to say, well, kind of in our response to you, that I guess what people are trying to point out is that what you're saying is that power comes from the bottom up, whereas it's not necessarily the only way. So if you can work from single examples and like activity that solves a project that solves it, if you want to become a phenomena that's more widespread, then if you have a network that works from the top down, that is gonna, well, it's not like from the top down that you expect the government to do it, but that all the people who are interested are linked, and a network, which is people who feel personally involved, but who maybe don't have the resources or don't know how to make it happen. So if you put, so you have an example, and then you make that, you teach people how to apply that example. You give them the tools for it, and you make that available as information, and you set up a network which is higher up. Then you can start to work from two sides, and you can apply what you're trying to do. Obviously, it's going to be case by case, but you need, I think, to make it be more successful, to be able to actually make a change which is really big, it's easier if you work from two sides instead of just from a single case itself. Because people are interested often, but they just don't know how to. So if you've already done it and you've gone through those hoops and you sort of advertise and talk about what you do, but you give information which is, you know, like you use the press if you can, you use every tool you've got, and there's a network above you that's supporting that too. It gives you more chances.
And then, yeah, maybe final comments?
So, I mean, responding to Marissa, and I think so what Picture the Homeless is doing is pretty good, like working together with the structure of the government. And you have to bring the governance to your government to make the government open the homeless. Because if you do that, you end up being a small percentage of people working against a small percentage of people that have a lot of money, and that fight you're gonna lose. So you have to find a way. You have to find a way to make civil society the society of the commons. And so it's by doing two things. We have to go out there, squat the buildings, but we have to find a way to make it legal so we can stay with the buildings and we can bring people in and bring homeless people in, have them have housing, but we need to do it permanently. And we have to work with government in a way. And so we need civic society to be aware. That's
So I just want to, I still see a couple hands, but just really out of time, we're going to move and ask the panelists to give like final remarks if they have any, and kind of wrap it up. We've been at this for a while. I'm excited to see there's energy though.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, before, we have another event at Brooklyn Base on Sunday. And can you tell us just what time it is and we'll details on that?
So it's Saturday, not on Sunday.
Oh, excuse me. Thanks.
7 p.m. Brooklyn Base, and it's right at, it's to connect to what you said. So the entrance is squatting and coming in. So from squatting to trust, that's the question we have from Eviction and Picture the Homeless, and I will present something about Berlin, the action plan,
16 Beaver commenting course. And then if people did want to get involved with this sort of expanded network that people are developing, if you want to get your name on here. So let's get our concluding remarks from the panelists, and then we can all chill and mingle afterwards. If you'd like to, no pressure. If you'd like to,
In terms of this question of either or, either direct action or policy, I feel like it can be both and. So just also picture the homeless, the groups, it's like going to school. If you're gonna go there and learn about community land trust, it's perfectly organized. There's the policy working group that deals with government, how to actually shift policy to make community land trust happen. There's outreach, so that you can learn about community land trust and do outreach. And then there's governance, like how do you organize together? And then case studies, so that you look at actual examples. So I think that's a perfect way to do it, and it's so exciting to learn. And I just want to say, it's not like, what are we doing? It's like, it's happening right here.
All I wanted to say is, hello? Oh yeah, it's working. All I wanted to say is that, this question is really interesting. It's really about being strategic. What are the actual goals? How can they be? If a piece of activism is what's necessary and direct action, let's do it. If there's a way to collectivize, to try to get some laws changed. There was a perfect example of something that needs to be done, that needs to be brought back, the homesteading law. That didn't go away that long ago. That was just Giuliani that took away the right to squat. And that is strategically a very kind of powerful thing to shoot for in a legal. So I agree with some of the things here. We've talked, some of the comments that were made is that even the community land trust, as wonderful as they are, they still participate in the economic sphere. It's not like they're not communes, which is, I find interesting. Is fully participating, but rethinking constantly, being critical. So I really like the proposal to think about the homesteading, and as well as learning about community land trust.
I'm just want to thank everyone. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I clearly come at things from the more direct action side of things. I think, I love what Picture the Homeless is doing and Take Back the Land. I think if we're gonna think about doing things like that, there's not that many groups, there's you guys, and we can't actually all end up at Picture the Homeless. But so we're gonna have to build things, right? And so for me, I think we build things where we are at, right? And I think the issues you brought up around we move all the time, and so where are we at? But I really think that we should really be thinking about who our neighbors are and what their issues are, and are they similar to our issues, and how can I build with you who lives next door to me or across the hall from me or across the street from me? Because we've been, I think, throwing around the word community a lot, and I think that's something we have to critically think about. What is our community? Who do we consider our community? Is where we live where our community is? And if not, why is that? And do we know our neighbors, and all those sorts of questions? So whether you build in your neighborhood or you realize your community is someplace else, we need to be building maybe more things like Picture the Homeless, whatever that would mean where you are. If that makes any sense.
I just wanted to end also by acknowledging Paula Siegel, who's here now, who's with 596 Acres. The reason I want to bring this up, actually, is that for me, we're working with 596 Acres on this project. What I think is really interesting about that project, also what I think is interesting about Our Goods, is that these are projects that work in this landscape now of publicly available data, of communications tools that are enabling new forms of cooperation, or actually really enabling old forms of cooperation, but perhaps mediated through a different technology. I think that's very exciting. And if you talk to planning departments now, city departments, everybody wants an app, and that's great, whatever. But I think what's really interesting about 596 Acres is that this is one of the first time that the anarchists have actually built an app that city governments like. And if people who have technical skills and can do that don't do that, it's just going to be left to the technocrats, which is what Bloomberg wants. So I think it's really important that if you have some kind of ability around working with data, working with spatial information, working with communicative tools, working with visualization, it's really important that you do this and not just sort of go home and whine about stuff, because otherwise it's just going to be the kind of like, incubator lab, happy Bloomberg people who hatch these schemes, which are not going to reflect the interests of people who are really working in the communities.
I walked in late. Has somebody brought up the New York City Community Land Initiative?
Yes.
That is the place that you can actually plug into. It is bigger than Picture the Homeless. The website went up today. I'm really excited about it because they have some of their own infrastructure, and we can make their infrastructure bigger, and we can actually do this all together and just growing. And it's actually already in motion. So let's all jump on it. It's totally opportunity because the website went up like 2 hours ago. What is the URL? It's nyccli.org.
And I just want to conclude that part of our mission at Picture the Homeless is to change the media stereotypes of homelessness. And 48% of the shelter system population works. I'm in a situation where I'm receiving unemployment. It's supposed to run out in 2 months. The way the system is currently structured, the people with mental illnesses and chemical abuse are the first ones that get into housing because they have supportive housing for that. So the conservative argument that this is just a big charity thing, it doesn't really have any weight to it, because they want to have an idea of homelessness that is not accurate. And we'd like to change that. Like I said, I've been homeless for 18 months and I have a master's degree. I am not the only person in the organization with an advanced degree. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to thank you all very much for presenting, sharing with us, and I want to thank everybody who came and participated and brought energy to the discussion. A goal in our organizing this was to bring people into dialogue who maybe aren't in dialogue often or regularly, and I think that we saw that, and I'm happy to see that there's different viewpoints and different strategies being employed around this